They say revolutions start with a single spark. But by the end of 1775, the American colonies weren't just sparking, they were smoldering. And the whole world was about to watch them burst into flames. Picture this: snow falling over the narrow, cobbled streets of Boston. Redcoats in gleaming uniforms march in formation, their boots pounding like war drums. Bayonets glint in the gray winter light. Doors slam shut as they pass. Curtains twitch. Behind them, people whisper. Mothers hush their children. Merchants nod politely, but their hands tremble. There's a tension in the air so thick you could slice it with a saber. Every step, every glance, every rumor carries the weight of something inevitable. The colonies aren't just restless. They're on the edge of a full-blown rebellion. It hadn't started with muskets and powder. Not exactly. The roots had been growing for years, buried deep in taxes, trade restrictions, and the quiet, slow erosion of rights the colonists believed they deserved. British Parliament, seated comfortably across the Atlantic, had been tightening its grip. First came the Stamp Act, then the Townshend Acts, and then the tipping point, the Coercive Acts, which the colonists bitterly renamed the Intolerable Acts. Boston paid the price when it dumped the tea into the harbor. Parliament answered with punishment. The port was shut. Massachusetts was put under martial law. And the people? They grew furious. In taverns and town halls from New Hampshire to Georgia, men and women gathered to talk, not of peace, but of defiance. In Virginia, Patrick Henry had already roared, "Give me liberty or give me death." And that wasn't just a slogan. It was becoming a prayer, a mantra, a war cry. By April of 1775, the whispers had turned into musket fire. British troops, under orders to confiscate colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders, had marched to Lexington and conquered. What they got instead was a firefight. No one knows who fired the first shot. But once that shot rang out, everything changed. Colonial militias, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers all grabbed their guns and stood shoulder to shoulder against trained British soldiers. The battles of Lexington and Concord weren't decisive victories, but they proved something more important. The colonists were willing to fight, and they could bleed redcoats. The siege of Boston followed. The city became a cage, British forces trapped inside by ragtag militias surrounding them. Cannons thundered from nearby hills. The smell of smoke, manure, and fear hung in the air. Bostonians lived under constant occupation, their once lively streets now full of soldiers, checkpoints, and spies. Meanwhile, the rest of the colonies held their breath. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened again, trying to decide whether these scattered flames could or should become a wildfire. Some delegates still prayed for reconciliation. Others, like John Adams, had already made peace with war. And somewhere in the wings, Thomas Jefferson listened quietly, preparing his pen for something bigger than anyone could yet imagine. But the decision hadn't been made. Not yet. Not officially. The winter dragged on. The world watched. And the British? They underestimated everything. They saw the colonists as unruly children who needed a firm hand. They believed that one show of force, one overwhelming military response, would crush the rebellion before it truly began. What they didn't understand was that the colonists weren't rebelling over one law or one tax or one bad year. They were revolting over a feeling, a belief, that they were not subjects, but citizens, that they deserved a say, that liberty was not a gift from a king, but a right from birth. And so the colonies waited. poised on the edge of something no one could fully see yet. In the smoky corners of taverns, men argued over ale about what should be done. In the fields, boys learned to aim their fathers' rifles. In churches, preachers thundered about divine justice and earthly kings. And in every home, every farm, every market stall, there was a quiet question rising like steam from a boiling kettle. Are we on the brink of something new, or the edge of destruction? Washington, newly appointed commander of the Continental Army, spent the last days of 1775 trying to hold together a force that barely qualified as an army. The men were underfed, undertrained, and undersupplied. Many had no uniforms, just hunting coats and homespun shirts. Their boots were worn, their weapons mismatched. But they had fire in their hearts. Washington knew it. He had seen it already in the fields of Massachusetts. He had seen it in their eyes, in the way they stood firm even when the odds were against them. Still, hope alone wasn't enough. Winter was closing in, ammunition was low, spirits were sinking, and every report said the British were preparing something big. The final weeks of the year ticked away like the slow winding of a fuse. Across the Atlantic, King George III had declared the colonies to be an open rebellion. There would be no peace talks, no negotiation. The hammer was coming down. But something else was coming too. A shift, an awakening. Because just as 1775 ended with blood and uncertainty, 1776 was waiting, like a loaded musket in the dark. The people didn't know it yet, but within the first month of the new year, a printer named Thomas Paine would unleash a pamphlet that would change everything. In a world full of soldiers, kings, and generals, it would be words, not bullets, that sparked the next explosion. And from there, the course of history would twist in ways no one could predict, not even the men writing it. The world was on fire, and 1776 was about to burn brighter than any year before it. The year began not with a shot, but with a sentence. In January 1776, the colonies were on edge. Blood had already been spilled, British troops still held Boston, and the Second Continental Congress debated endlessly over whether they were fighting for rights within the British Empire or for something far more dangerous. Independence was in the air, but no one dared say it out loud. At least, not until a newcomer walked into the chaos and lit the fuse. His name was Thomas Paine. He wasn't famous, he wasn't rich, and he certainly wasn't born American. In fact, he had arrived in Philadelphia from England just over a year before, carrying little more than a letter of recommendation from Benjamin Franklin and a head full of ideas. He had worked as a corset maker, a teacher, a customs officer, and a tax collector. He had failed at nearly all of them, but he knew how to write. And now, the revolution needed a writer. Paine had watched the colonies boil over in frustration. He saw the protests, the bloodshed, the fear. But more importantly, he saw something few others did: the potential. Not just for resistance, but for transformation, for a clean break, for a completely new kind of nation, one not ruled by kings and inherited power, but by the people themselves. So he picked up his pen. The result was a 47-page pamphlet titled simply Common Sense. It had no cover image, no celebrity endorsement, just words. But those words struck like thunder. Published on January 10th, 1776. Common Sense was more than a pamphlet. It was a bomb. It ripped through the colonies with force, selling 120,000 copies in just the first 3 months. A staggering number in a population of around 2 million. Within a year, it would sell 500,000. For perspective, That would be like tens of millions of copies today. But it wasn't just the numbers. It was who was reading it. Farmers read it aloud to their families at night. Blacksmiths passed it hand to hand between hammer swings. Tavern owners left it on counters. Preachers quoted it from pulpits. It spread not just among the educated elite, but to the common people, the exact audience Paine had written it for. And that was the genius of it. Paine didn't write like a statesman. He wrote like a man on fire. His language was plain, forceful, and emotional. He didn't argue with careful legalese. He preached with the clarity of a prophet. He opened with a bold claim. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right. And from there, he tore into the monarchy, calling it absurd, unnatural, and unjust. Kings were not chosen by God, he wrote. They were chosen by accident of birth, often the product of incestuous lines and violent ambition. Why should any free people submit to such a system? Paine didn't tiptoe. He punched. He attacked the British government not as flawed, but as fundamentally rotten. And he didn't stop there. He called out the idea of reconciliation with Britain as a lie. He mocked the logic of wanting peace with a country that had already fired on American citizens. Even brutes do not devour their young, he wrote, nor savages make war upon their families. So why should America cling to a mother country that treated her children like enemies? But what made common sense so powerful wasn't just the anger. It was the vision. Paine didn't just rage against the crown. He painted a picture of what could come next. He argued for a republic, a government based on representation, not monarchy. He described how America could trade freely with Europe, form its own navy, govern itself, and thrive. He turned rebellion into opportunity. Independence wasn't a desperate act, it was a destiny. And he gave the colonists something they hadn't yet dared to believe: permission. Paine told them it was not only possible to break away from Britain, it was necessary. And not tomorrow. Now. In the halls of Congress, the pamphlets sent tremors. Many of the delegates were stunned. They had been carefully avoiding the word independence for months, worried it would fracture the colonies or provoke Britain into a total war. Now, with one document, the idea was on every tongue. John Adams was thrilled. He saw in Paine's words a rallying cry, a way to bring the common people into the movement. Others were nervous. They agreed with the sentiment, but feared the timing. Still, no one could deny it. The needle had shifted. Outside the government, common sense did something even more remarkable. It unified the mood of the people. Until now, opinions had varied wildly. Some wanted full independence. Some still hoped for peace. Many weren't sure at all. But Paine's pamphlet didn't leave room for doubt. He framed the situation in moral terms. It wasn't about politics. It was about right and wrong. Suddenly, questioning the king wasn't treasonous. It was patriotic. It's easy today to forget just how radical that was. In 1776, monarchy wasn't just common, it was normal. Kings ruled most of the known world. Challenging that system was like questioning gravity. But common sense flipped the script. It made monarchy seem like the unnatural system, and it made the idea of popular rule feel not only logical, but righteous. That shift was seismic. It didn't win the war. It didn't raise armies or fire cannons. But it did something just as important. It prepared the mind. Because revolutions don't just happen on battlefields. They happen in the soul. And Paine had lit a fire there. Throughout January, Printers across the colonies rushed to keep up with demand. New editions, with updated footnotes or minor corrections, were released almost weekly. Pirated copies spread just as fast. And since many people were illiterate or semi-literate, it became common for someone to read the pamphlet aloud to a gathered crowd, at town meetings, in churches, or around a tavern hearth. Even General George Washington took notice. He had not fully committed to independence in his heart, still hoping for some peaceful resolution. But after reading Common Sense, he wrote to friends that the case for breaking away now seemed far more compelling. He saw its effect on the troops. Soldiers read it aloud in camps. Officers discussed it between drills. The pamphlet gave them purpose beyond defense. It gave them a cause. And all of this happened in just a few short weeks. By the end of January, Common Sense had done more to spread the revolutionary spirit than perhaps any single battle or speech. It wasn't perfect. Pain was abrasive. His later writings would become controversial. But in that moment, in that winter, he was exactly what the revolution needed. He was the match in a room full of powder kegs. And as the snow melted and the debates in Congress continued, something had shifted permanently. The people were no longer whispering about independence. They were shouting it. The colonies had entered 1776 unsure of their future, unsure if they were fighting for reform or rebirth. But by the time Paine's words had echoed through every town and colony, that doubt was fading fast. Now the only question was, who would lead the way? Because once the idea took hold, once the mind tasted freedom, there was no going back. Common Sense had done its job. Now, the world would watch what the colonies would do with it. While Thomas Paine's Common Sense stirred minds and sharpened convictions, the cold reality of war gripped the land. As January faded into February, the philosophical fire of independence met the brutal ice of military necessity. And nowhere was that contrast more vivid than in the snow-covered hills outside Boston. There, George Washington, general of an army that barely deserved the name, stood facing the greatest military power on earth. His soldiers were exhausted. Supplies were vanishing. And the winter was only growing crueler. Boston had been under siege for months. Ever since the first shots at Lexington and Concord, rebel militias had surrounded the city, trapping thousands of British soldiers and loyalists inside. What began as an improvised act of resistance was now a slow-burning standoff. Washington arrived in July 1775 to take command of the Continental Army. But what he found was chaos. Different state militias, no standardized uniforms, poor discipline, and hardly any weapons. Most men had never fought in a real battle. They were volunteers, farmers, tradesmen, boys. They had heart, but not much else. Washington tried to instill order. He drilled the men, demanded respect for rank, and instituted military codes. But discipline didn't fix supply shortages. Ammunition was low, tents were scarce. Many soldiers lacked shoes. Their coats were threadbare. Smallpox outbreaks flared up in the camps. Men were freezing. Some deserted. Others begged to go home once their enlistments expired. Yet they stayed. Enough of them, at least. Through blizzards, hunger, and disease, they clung to their purpose. Because even if they lacked formal training, they had something the British didn't. The land. The hills around Boston gave the rebels the high ground. And Washington, ever the strategist, knew it. He just needed one thing: artillery. Which brings us to one of the most remarkable feats of the entire war, and one of the most overlooked. Enter Henry Knox. He was 25 years old, a former bookseller from Boston with no formal military education, but a passion for artillery. He had read every manual he could find. Washington saw potential in him and gave him a task that seemed impossible. Knox was to travel over 300 miles in the dead of winter to Fort Ticonderoga, up in New York near the Canadian border. The fort had been captured earlier that year by Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, and inside it were dozens of heavy cannons, abandoned British artillery that no one had yet moved. Knox's mission: retrieve those guns and bring them to Boston. It was madness. The journey would take him through forests, across frozen rivers, and over mountains. The cannons weighed thousands of pounds. He would need oxen, sleds, and sheer willpower. But Knox didn't hesitate. In December 1775, he set out with a small team, battling snowdrifts, ice storms, and collapsing sleds. At times, they had to drag the guns by hand when the oxen failed. Locals stared in disbelief. "That man is either a genius or a lunatic," one farmer said. After 6 grueling weeks, in late January 1776, Knox returned. With him came 60 tons of artillery, mortars, howitzers, cannons, enough to shift the balance of power. Washington now had the pieces. All he needed was the right moment to play them. The opportunity came in March. The British, led by General William Howe, still held Boston, but they were exposed. The city was vulnerable to bombardment from the high ground south of town, Dorchester Heights. If the rebels could get artillery up there, Boston would be at their mercy. There was just one problem. Dorchester Heights was open, flat. Anyone moving there would be seen immediately and likely torn to shreds by British fire. It was suicide, unless it was done in one night. Washington devised a plan. On the night of March 4th, under cover of darkness, thousands of men moved silently through the cold. Wagons creaked, shovels scraped, carts full of hay muffled the sound of wheels. Entire regiments labored to move cannon, build earthworks, and position artillery, all in a single night. They used pre-made fortifications built weeks in advance and hauled them into place like a stage set. When the sun rose on March 5th, Boston awoke to a terrifying sight. The heights were covered with cannons, pointed straight at the British fleet in the harbor. General Howe was stunned. His officers were stunned. One reportedly said, "The rebels have done more in one night than our army would do in a month." They had no choice. To remain in Boston was to risk total destruction. Howe considered launching an assault on the heights, but a snowstorm intervened. Washington used the time to reinforce his position. Within days, Howe realized the city was lost. On March 17th, 1776, the British evacuated Boston. They loaded their ships and sailed away, taking thousands of loyalists with them. No shots were fired, no battles were fought. The city was won with cannons, courage, and cunning. It was Washington's first major victory, and a badly needed one. The siege of Boston was over. But while the Continental Army celebrated, the larger picture remained grim. The British had left Boston, yes, but they weren't gone. They were regrouping, and next time, they wouldn't be caught off guard. Meanwhile, Washington faced new problems. His army's enlistments were expiring. Hundreds of soldiers returned home. Others, frustrated by poor conditions and lack of pay, refused to re-enlist. Congress promised money, supplies, and reinforcements, but everything moved slowly. Washington begged, pleaded, and even threatened. But he couldn't force men to stay. The army dwindled again. And worse, the victory in Boston had created a dangerous illusion that the British could be scared off with just the right bluff. Some began to believe the war might be won without full-scale confrontation. But Washington knew better. He had seen the British numbers. He had read the dispatches. Reinforcements were coming. Thousands of fresh troops, supported by warships, would soon arrive. And next time, they wouldn't be boxed in. Washington didn't have time to rest. He marched his army south toward New York. The city was the logical next target for the British. Its deep harbor, central location, and divided population made it a tempting prize. Holding it would mean controlling the Hudson River. Losing it could mean losing the war. As spring approached, the streets of New York filled with tension. British sympathizers whispered in corners, rebel militias drilled in alleyways, churches and taverns became hotbeds of espionage. Everyone was waiting. Everyone knew the storm was coming. And Washington? He prepared as best he could. He fortified the city. He built defenses on Manhattan and Brooklyn. He tried to mold his dwindling, chaotic army into a real fighting force. But deep down, he feared what was ahead. Because the victory in Boston had not changed one hard truth. America was still outmatched, outgunned, and dangerously unprepared. They had won a city, but they had not yet won a war. The Revolution had stepped out of winter and into fire. And 1776 still had many battles left to fight. The cannons had driven the British out of Boston, but they hadn't silenced the question at the heart of the Revolution. Were the colonies truly ready to break away? As spring crept across the land, trees blooming and roads thawing, the war entered a strange limbo. Guns still fired in scattered places, armies still trained, but something else filled the air now. Something less visible, but just as fierce. Debate. In Philadelphia, the weather warmed. But inside the Pennsylvania State House, the building that would one day be called Independence Hall, the atmosphere was anything but pleasant. The Second Continental Congress, a collection of delegates from 13 very different colonies, sat in worn chairs and paced narrow hallways, wrestling with an impossible decision. Independence, treason, war or compromise, loyalty, hope. The room was filled with names we now engrave in marble. Benjamin Franklin, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, already a legend in his own time. John Adams, fiery and unyielding, driven by principle. Thomas Jefferson, young and reserved, listening more than speaking, for now. They were radicals in the making. But they were not the majority, not yet. Because the truth is, in the spring of 1776, the colonies weren't united. Not truly. Many still clung to the idea that reconciliation with Britain was possible, that King George III might come to his senses, that this war, these scattered battles and smoldering cities, might somehow be reversed, calmed, negotiated. Others feared something worse, chaos. To sever ties with Britain meant diving headfirst into the unknown. No king, no government, no allies, no currency, no structure. Just 13 colonies, each with its own traditions, rivalries, and fears, trying to forge something new out of smoke and fury. Some delegates came from places where British influence still held strong. New York's leaders were split. Pennsylvania was torn between its merchant class and its rural Quaker base. Maryland and South Carolina worried about losing trade, about slave uprisings, about being left defenseless. Even in Massachusetts, where blood had been shed and cities burned, there were still whispers. Maybe it's not too late. Maybe the king doesn't know what Parliament has done. Maybe we just need to be heard. But John Adams didn't want to wait. Neither did Franklin. They saw the writing on the wall, or rather, the blood on the soil. Adams stood often, his voice cutting through the noise like a bayonet. "There is no middle ground," he declared again and again. "We are in open rebellion, whether we admit it or not. The Crown has declared us traitors. What do we gain by pretending otherwise?" Franklin, ever the diplomat, knew how to soften the blow, but not the message. "We must all hang together," he quipped dryly, "or assuredly we shall all hang separately." It was gallows humor, but it was also true. Every day the delegates waited, the danger grew. British forces were regrouping. More ships were crossing the Atlantic. Reinforcements would land soon. And when they did, they would not come with treaties. They would come with fire. Outside the halls of Congress, the public mood was shifting. Common sense had done its work. The pamphlet had spread like wildfire through every colony, making the argument for independence not just plausible, but popular. Farmers who had never spoken the word republic now used it with pride. Shopkeepers who once feared rebellion now wondered why it hadn't come sooner. The taverns were full of opinions. And increasingly, those opinions leaned toward freedom. And so, Congress felt the pressure, not just from within, but from without. Militias passed resolutions urging their representatives to vote for independence. Townships sent letters. Even some colonial legislatures began authorizing their delegates to vote for separation from the Crown. But still, hesitation lingered. Every word spoken in that chamber carried the weight of history. This wasn't just a policy decision. It was a declaration of existence. And failure meant not just defeat, but death. In late March and early April, the arguments grew sharper. Some delegates still wanted one last petition to the king, one final plea. Others warned that Britain would never take such pleas seriously, not after Lexington, not after Bunker Hill, not after Boston. The line had already been crossed. They just hadn't admitted it yet. Then came the moment that began to change everything. North Carolina became the first colony to instruct its delegates to vote for independence. It was bold, unapologetic, and contagious. Soon after, Virginia followed. And with Virginia came its heavy weight, its size, its influence, its voices. Patrick Henry had already thundered in its legislature, "Give me liberty, or give me death." Now his colony spoke with one voice. The time had come. The dam began to crack. Still, New York hesitated. So did Pennsylvania. Delaware was split between loyalists and rebels. Maryland leaned conservative. The fate of the resolution rested on whether enough of the colonies could be persuaded to unify, not just a slim majority, but a united front. Anything less would fracture the rebellion before it had begun. And so the lobbying intensified. Adams met with delegates privately. He wrote letters. He gave speech after speech. Jefferson worked behind the scenes. Franklin used every ounce of his wit and wisdom to sway the unsure. Day after day, the delegates argued. Some shouted, some wept, some begged for more time. And then, a new wave of British ships was spotted off the American coast. Reality had arrived. And with it, clarity. By mid-May, Congress passed a resolution urging all colonies to establish new governments. No more loyalty to the king, no more pretending. The gloves were off. In June, Virginia formally proposed that Congress declare independence. It was time. A committee was formed to draft the document. 5 men were chosen: Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. But the task of writing the first draft fell to Jefferson. Quiet, meticulous, Brilliant. He returned to his rented room and picked up his pen. The storm had broken, but in those early spring days, before the vote, before the draft, before the bells rang out, there was only tension, suspense, a nation pacing the edge of a cliff, not yet ready to jump, but already falling. Were they angry subjects demanding justice, or revolutionaries building a new world? The answer came not from a single man or a single moment, but from the clash of ideas in a hot room in Philadelphia, where every word might be their last as British citizens and their first as Americans. The room was quiet, but Thomas Jefferson's mind was not. Outside, Philadelphia hummed with the noise of summer. Horses clattering on cobblestones, blacksmiths hammering iron, children laughing, and somewhere, a preacher warning that the end of days might be near. The air was thick with heat and thicker still with anticipation. But inside the small rented room on the second floor of a brick house at the corner of 7th and Market, a single man sat hunched over a writing desk, quill in hand, dripping sweat and trying to change the course of history. It was June 1776, and Jefferson had been given an impossible task. Write the birth certificate of a nation that didn't yet exist. The vote for independence hadn't happened yet. The colonies still wavered. Congress still debated. But something had shifted. The idea was no longer whispered. It was expected. A formal declaration was needed, something clear and defiant, something that would tell the world not only that the colonies were separating from Britain, but why. It had to be legal, but also poetic, practical, but powerful. Something that could rally farmers in New Jersey and philosophers in France. Something worthy of revolution. So they turned to Jefferson. He was young, just 33 years old, but already known for his elegant writing and sharp intellect. A lawyer, a planter, and a thinker, Jefferson had a quiet intensity that made him hard to ignore. When the Committee of Five, Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, was tasked with drafting the Declaration, no one seriously challenged the idea that Jefferson would be the primary author. Even John Adams, who had more seniority and ambition, deferred. "You can write 10 times better than I can," he told Jefferson, and he meant it. So Jefferson began. The room was small, spare, and stifling in the June heat. He opened the window for air, though the noise and insects crept in with it. He wrote on a portable lap desk he had designed himself, a simple contraption with a slanted surface and a drawer for ink and paper. He dipped his quill, scratched it across the parchment, and began with words that would one day be memorized by generations. When, in the course of human events, the ideas weren't new. Jefferson drew from English philosophy, Enlightenment thinkers, colonial grievances, and his own writings. He had read John Locke. He had studied Montesquieu. But what he did in those lines was something different. He transformed theory into thunder. He wrote of natural rights, not as privileges granted by a king, but as truths born with every human being: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not property, not obedience. Happiness. A radical choice, and a powerful one. He listed the crimes of the British Crown, not just as policy complaints, but as evidence of tyranny. He painted George III not as a misguided monarch, but as a despot unfit to rule a free people. And in doing so, he didn't just write a breakup letter with Britain. He wrote a new philosophy of government. All men are created equal. Governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. when they become destructive of those ends. It is the right of the people to alter or abolish them. No divine right, no inherited rule, no unquestioned loyalty, just people, free, equal, and sovereign. But even as the words poured from his pen, Jefferson knew they would not survive untouched. Congress was full of men with strong opinions and sharp pens. There would be edits, there would be debates, there would be compromises, and he was right. Jefferson presented his draft to the Committee of Five. Franklin offered suggestions. Adams argued over phrasing. Then it was submitted to Congress itself, and the real carving began. Over the course of 2 heated days, Jefferson watched as Congress debated, struck out lines, and changed wording. His long list of grievances was shortened. His blistering condemnation of the slave trade, where he accused King George of violating human rights by perpetuating slavery in the colonies, was removed entirely. The Southern delegates, whose economies depended on enslaved labor, refused to support the document if it remained. And the Northern merchants, many of whom profited from the trade, did not object loudly. It was one of the great ironies of the Revolution, a declaration that proclaimed liberty while sidestepping slavery. Jefferson, a slaveholder himself, had written against the practice, but accepted the edits. He was furious, but not surprised. The Revolution needed unity, and unity came with cost. He said little during the revisions. He sat silently, lips tight, as his masterpiece was trimmed and reshaped. Later, he would write bitterly about the edits, calling them mutilations. But he also understood something deeper. The words themselves were only part of the story. It was the act of declaring that mattered most. And so the draft emerged, scarred but strong. By the end of June, the colonies edged closer to a final vote. State after state instructed their delegates to vote yes. The momentum was irreversible now. The document was ready. The minds had shifted. Only the official decision remained. Jefferson, exhausted and uncertain, waited. The significance of what he had written had not yet dawned on the world. There were no fireworks, no bands, no grand speeches, just sweat, ink, and silence. In that little room, in the heat of June, a new idea had been born. Not just a nation, but a new way of thinking about power, about freedom, about what it meant to govern. It was fragile. It was incomplete. It was controversial. But it was real. And soon, it would belong not to Jefferson, not to Congress, but to history. Because what began as a quiet task in a hot room would soon become the voice of a revolution. They say it happened on the 4th of July, that the Declaration was signed, the bell rang, and a nation was born in a single glorious moment. Fireworks, celebration, thunderclaps of liberty echoing across the colonies. But the truth is messier, more human, and in many ways more powerful. By the start of July, the 13 colonies had reached a breaking point. The debates in Philadelphia had dragged on for weeks. Words had been sharpened like swords. Fists had pounded on tables. Arguments flared and cooled and flared again. But momentum was building, and the outcome was becoming inevitable. On July 1st, Congress reconvened to begin the final debate on Richard Henry Lee's resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. 12 colonies cast their votes that day, but not all in favor. South Carolina wavered, Pennsylvania was split, and New York's delegates, unsure of their instructions, abstained entirely. The chamber was tense, not yet unanimous. John Adams, as always, pushed forward. He rose, voice full of fire, to argue once more that history had cornered them. That delay was defeat. that half measures were death. His speech didn't echo through the ages, no transcript survives. But those who heard it said it moved the room like no speech before it. It wasn't elegant, it was raw, and it worked. On the morning of July 2nd, the delegates voted again. This time, South Carolina switched sides. Pennsylvania's internal divisions collapsed under pressure. 2 of its loyalist delegates stayed home. New York still abstained, waiting for confirmation from Albany. But 12 out of 13 had spoken. The vote passed. That was the day the United States declared independence. Not the 4th, the 2nd. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that night, full of pride and anticipation. The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations. He was right about the celebration, but wrong about the date. Because while Congress had voted for independence on July 2nd, the document that would declare it to the world, the Declaration of Independence, was still being edited. Jefferson's draft had been delivered days before. The Committee of 5 had approved it. But now Congress combed through it, line by line, striking phrases, softening accusations, trimming ideas. They removed Jefferson's condemnation of slavery, too divisive. They altered his rhythm, tweaked his grammar, added caution where he had used fire. He fumed silently as they changed his words. But he did not protest. He knew what was at stake. The editing took 2 days. And finally, on the morning of July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the final version of the Declaration of Independence. They ordered it to be printed by John Dunlap, a local printer who stayed up through the night producing broadside copies to be sent throughout the colonies. Those would be the first public glimpses of the new nation's founding document. But here's the twist. No one actually signed it on July 4th. Contrary to the iconic painting we all know, Jefferson presenting the parchment to Franklin and Adams, surrounded by powdered wigs and solemn faces. There was no grand signing ceremony that day. Only John Hancock and Charles Thompson, the President and Secretary of Congress, likely signed the first printed copy. The rest would come later, much later. The official engrossed parchment, the one written in elegant calligraphy on animal skin, now stored in the National Archives, wasn't even ready until August. Most delegates didn't sign it until August 2nd. Some not until months later. A few never signed at all. So what did happen on the 4th of July? A vote. An adoption of a final text. And a quiet moment in a hot room where exhausted men realized that, with one decision, they had changed the world and placed their own heads in a noose. Outside, the city didn't erupt into celebration. Not yet. The news was still being printed, still being spread. But by July 6th, newspapers were publishing the text. By July 8th, the Declaration was read aloud in public for the first time in Philadelphia's State House yard. Crowds gathered, bells rang, militia fired salutes, bonfires were lit. And somewhere, perhaps, yes, the Liberty Bell rang. Though historians now doubt that it happened on the 4th itself, or even that the bell was called the Liberty Bell yet. It may not have even rung at all that day. The steeple was undergoing repairs. But does it matter? Because myth, like freedom, often grows from truth, not precision. The 4th of July became the symbolic birthday of a nation, not because everything happened on that day, but because it felt like the moment the break became real. The moment the words were chosen, the moment the new American identity was etched into history. What Jefferson wrote, what Congress approved, what Dunlap printed, that became the soul of the revolution. When people read it, they didn't just see a list of complaints. They saw themselves. They saw farmers, blacksmiths, and school teachers reborn as free citizens. They saw governments answerable to people, not kings. They saw a future not defined by empire, but by equality, at least in theory. The contradictions were there from the start. All men are created equal, Jefferson wrote while owning hundreds of enslaved people. Unalienable rights, he declared, while half the population, women, had none. The document was radical, but it was also incomplete. And yet, it changed everything. The world now had a manifesto for freedom. France read it. So did Spain. So did the enemies of monarchy everywhere. It would inspire revolutions in Haiti, in South America, in Europe. It would become the creed of civil rights leaders, abolitionists, suffragists, and dissidents for generations to come. And it all began not with a dramatic signing or the toll of a bell, but with men in a sweltering room, finally daring to put their ideals to paper, to declare with trembling hands and steady hearts that the colonies were no longer colonies, that they were free, that they were united, that they were something entirely new. The United States of America was not truly born on July 4th, but the Declaration was, and with it, the idea of America. They had done it. They had declared independence. Across the colonies, bells rang and bonfires burned. In town squares, crowds gathered to hear the Declaration read aloud for the first time. People cheered, wept, toasted liberty, and fired muskets into the summer air. On July 9th in New York City, after hearing the Declaration, a mob tore down a statue of King George III on horseback. They melted it down for bullets, more than 40,000 musket balls made from the king's head and body. It was symbolic and practical. The colonies would need every one of them. In Philadelphia, there was a new energy. Suddenly, everything felt different. Farmers were now citizens. The war was no longer a protest, it was a revolution. But revolutions don't pause for celebration. Because while the ink on the Declaration dried, sails appeared on the horizon. British sails, hundreds of them. The storm was coming. The British had not been idle. Far from it. They had been preparing the largest expeditionary force ever sent across the Atlantic. A massive armada, packed with soldiers, cannons, horses, wagons, and food. Led by General William Howe and his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, it was a hammer, and New York was the anvil. By mid-July, British ships filled the waters off Staten Island. Troop transports, warships, supply barges. It was an overwhelming sight. The colonists had never seen anything like it. More than 30,000 British and Hessian troops would eventually land. Some had fought in Europe. Some were mercenaries from Germany, paid to crush rebellion. All of them were trained, armed, and ready. And waiting for them was George Washington. He had moved his army south from Boston, knowing New York would be next. But what he found in New York was trouble. The city was hard to defend. Surrounded by water with high ground across the rivers, it was vulnerable to naval attack. The population was divided, many loyal to the crown. Spies operated freely. The terrain was confusing. And Washington's army? It was a patchwork. Different militias from different colonies. Volunteers with little training. No navy. Poor supply lines. Worse, Washington didn't know where the British would strike. Manhattan, Brooklyn, Long Island, all of the above. So he did what he could. He dug trenches, he fortified Brooklyn Heights, he placed artillery, he trained his men, argued with his officers, and prayed for reinforcements. But deep down, he knew. They weren't ready. The Declaration had changed the politics, but it hadn't changed the math. The British had more men, more guns, more ships, more food, more experience, and they were coming. Still, the colonies held their breath and celebrated. In Massachusetts, church bells rang. In Virginia, taverns raised glasses to liberty. In the Carolinas, militias drilled harder than ever. But behind the joy, there was fear. Everyone knew the fight was only beginning. Even in Congress, the mood shifted. July's cheers gave way to August's worry. Delegates who had signed the Declaration now received death threats. Some moved their families. Some began carrying pistols. All understood what they had done. They hadn't just signed a document. They had signed a death warrant, if the war was lost. Meanwhile, British generals hoped for a quick end. The Hows weren't just soldiers. They were diplomats. They had been given power to negotiate if the rebels would submit. A peace commission was quietly offered. If the colonies would lay down their arms and return to obedience, the king would forgive. But Washington would not meet under those terms. He was a general now, not a subject. Congress refused to reverse course. They had declared independence, and the only question left was whether they could defend it. In August, the British made their move. They landed on Long Island in force. More than 15,000 soldiers, marching in crisp red lines, drums pounding, bayonets gleaming. The Americans, positioned on Brooklyn Heights, watched from their trenches. Washington was outnumbered, outflanked, and outmaneuvered. The Battle of Long Island, also called the Battle of Brooklyn, was the largest of the war, and a disaster for the Continental Army. The British attacked from multiple directions, using local roads to bypass American defenses. Confused, panicked, and surrounded, many American units broke. Hundreds were killed. Over 1,000 were captured. One American officer would later write, "It was a scene of horror beyond description." Washington watched helplessly from a nearby hill, teeth clenched. But the worst was yet to come. His entire army was trapped, cornered on Brooklyn Heights with the East River behind them and British forces closing in. If the British pressed the attack, they could crush the revolution in a single blow. But they didn't. Howe hesitated, perhaps cautious after Bunker Hill or hoping Washington would surrender. He paused, and in that pause, Washington acted. On the night of August 29th, under cover of darkness and fog, he ordered a full evacuation. Using small boats, his men ferried across the East River silently. No lights, no talking, no splashing. It took all night. Washington himself waited until the last man had boarded. At dawn, as the fog lifted, the British discovered the Americans were gone. It was one of the greatest retreats in military history. A defeat, yes, but also a miracle. Washington had preserved the army. The revolution lived on, but the mood was dark. In September, the British captured New York City. Fires broke out. Some started by rebels, others by accident. Much of the city burned. The British cracked down, arresting suspected traitors, tightening control. For the next 7 years, New York would remain in British hands. Washington's army retreated north. Soldiers deserted. Morale collapsed. In the summer, there had been hope. But now, there was only fear. Still, something strange happened. Even in defeat, even as the British took city after city, the American cause didn't die. Because now, it wasn't just about land. It was about belief. The Declaration had changed the stakes. The colonies had declared themselves a nation, a people. Not perfect, not united, not powerful, but determined. And even as the summer sun faded and shadows lengthened across the land, that belief refused to die. Not yet. Not in 1776. They saw the ships before they heard them. Sails, hundreds of them, appearing like ghosts on the horizon, blotting out the sky. By mid-August 1776, the British fleet had arrived. It was the largest armada ever to cross the Atlantic. And it was here for one reason: to crush the rebellion. On board were more than 30,000 men. British redcoats, Hessian mercenaries, artillerymen, sailors, cavalry, drummers, fifers, and generals. They brought cannon, powder, rations, uniforms, tents, horses, and discipline forged in the fires of European warfare. They were professionals, veterans, and they had come to New York to remind the colonies who ruled them. Facing them, on the other side of the harbor, stood George Washington and his army, if it could still be called that. Washington had roughly 20,000 men under his command, but that number was deceptive. Most were untrained militia, volunteers from farms, small towns, and workshops, teenagers next to gray-haired farmers. Their weapons were mismatched, their clothing worn thin. Some had never fired a musket in battle. Others hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. They had spirit. But spirit only carried you so far. Washington knew it. He had spent the summer desperately preparing New York City for the inevitable assault. He'd fortified Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Governor's Island. He spread his forces thin to cover every possible landing point. And that was the problem. He had no idea where the British would strike. General William Howe, leading the British land forces, had the advantage, not only in numbers and training, but in mobility. With control of the sea, the British could land anywhere along the coast of Long Island or Manhattan. They could attack from the front, the side, the rear, or all at once. Washington had to guess, and he guessed wrong. On August 22nd, the British made their move. They began landing on the southern shores of Long Island, now Brooklyn, with little resistance. Tens of thousands of redcoats and Hessians swarmed ashore. They marched inland in perfect formation, drums beating. The invasion had begun. Washington rushed reinforcements to Brooklyn Heights, where his men dug trenches and prepared for battle. He positioned them along ridgelines and hills, believing the British would attack head-on. But he had underestimated Howe. The British didn't charge forward. They outflanked him. In the early hours of August 27th, as fog clung to the trees, Howe sent a small force to engage the American front. At the same time, he led the bulk of his army on a long, silent march around Washington's left flank, through an unguarded mountain pass known as Jamaica Pass. By the time the Americans realized what had happened, it was too late. British troops crashed into the American lines from multiple directions. Panic erupted. Men dropped their muskets and ran. Some tried to stand and fight, only to be overwhelmed. Others were bayoneted without mercy by Hessians who spoke no English and offered no quarter. One American officer would later describe the scene: confusion and slaughter, men crying out to God, others cursing the day they were born. It was a disaster. More than 1,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The British lost only a fraction of that. Entire regiments of Americans were surrounded and forced to surrender. Some prisoners were marched into makeshift camps where they would languish, starve, or die from disease. Washington, watching from a hill across the East River, was horrified. He had never seen anything like it. His men were being crushed, and he could do nothing to stop it. But even worse, he now realized his entire army was trapped. The British had pushed the Americans back to Brooklyn Heights, a narrow peninsula hemmed in by water on three sides. Behind them, the East River. In front of them, British cannons and bayonets. If Howe pressed his advantage, he could end the war in one final stroke. Destroy the army, capture Washington, burn the revolution to the ground. But he didn't. Howe paused. Historians still debate why. Some say he feared heavy losses if he attacked the fortifications directly. Others suggest he hoped Washington would surrender, avoiding more bloodshed. Still others believe Howe was simply cautious by nature. Whatever the reason, the pause gave Washington time to plan a miracle. On the night of August 29th, as a cold wind blew across the East River, Washington ordered a full retreat. He summoned every available boat, ferries, barges, rowboats, and began ferrying his entire army across the river to Manhattan. It was a logistical nightmare. The river was wide, the tide unpredictable, the boats small, and the operation had to be conducted in total silence. No torches, no shouted commands, no dropped equipment. One noise, one scout, one flare, and the British would know. The crossing went on all night. Men loaded onto boats in the dark, clutching rifles, holding their breath. Officers guided them by whisper. Horses were led across on rafts. Cannons were lowered into flatboats, creaking under the weight. Washington himself crossed back and forth repeatedly, refusing to leave until the last man was safe. And then, as dawn approached, disaster threatened. The sun began to rise before the operation was complete. The British would soon be able to see the retreat. But then, it happened. A thick fog rolled in from the river. Dense, white, impenetrable. It cloaked the final hours of the evacuation like a curtain pulled over a stage. Washington's army vanished into the mist. When the British finally advanced, they found empty trenches. The Americans were gone. Not a man had been lost during the retreat. It was a miracle. A military escape so daring, so precise, it would be studied for centuries. And it had saved the revolution. But the victory was short-lived. In the weeks that followed, Washington and his army suffered again and again. The British landed on Manhattan and defeated the Americans at Kip's Bay. They drove them northward, taking Fort Washington and capturing thousands more men. Washington retreated through Harlem, then White Plains, then across the Hudson River into New Jersey. His army was bleeding. Desertions, hunger, disease. What had started as 20,000 men in the summer had dwindled to just a few thousand ragged survivors by fall. New York was lost. The British would hold it for the rest of the war. For Washington, it was a lesson in humility. He had tried to defend everything and lost nearly all of it. He learned that his army couldn't win by fighting the British in open fields. That retreat wasn't always cowardice. It could be strategy. That survival, not glory, was the key to revolution. And through it all, he never gave up. He rode through the rain beside his men, slept in tents, ate stale bread, encouraged the wounded, disciplined the cowards. He was not a brilliant tactician, not yet. But he was becoming something else. A leader. Someone who could endure humiliation, defeat, and despair, and keep going. Because the war wasn't over, not by a long shot. And even as the sun set on a city lost in a summer of defeat, something stubborn remained. A will to fight, to survive, to outlast the empire that had come to crush them. The battle for New York was over, but the fight for America had only begun. Autumn arrived not with golden leaves and harvest, but with dread. After the humiliating defeat in New York, Washington's army was broken, bloodied, and running. British troops pushed forward like a slow, unstoppable tide. The dream of independence, so proudly declared just months before, now flickered like a candle in the wind. Morale collapsed. Entire companies deserted. Shoes fell apart on the march. Blankets were shared. Ammunition ran low. Some men wandered off into the woods and never returned. Others cursed Congress, cursed the officers, cursed the very idea of a new nation. Washington could see it in their eyes. The hunger, the hopelessness. He was now a general without victories, commanding an army without faith. And things were only getting worse. By September, the British had taken New York City. They dug in, confident and comfortable, using the city as a base. Washington had no choice but to retreat across the Hudson into New Jersey, then across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Each step backward was a cut to the cause. Each retreat a whisper in the minds of the people. Maybe this isn't going to work. The British followed slowly, methodically. They occupied New Jersey town after town, New Brunswick, Princeton, Trenton. The local populations, sensing the wind had shifted, began pledging loyalty to the crown again. And in Philadelphia, panic spread. The Continental Congress, the very body that had declared independence, now faced the real possibility of British troops knocking at its doors. The delegates packed their trunks and fled the city, scattering to Baltimore, York, and beyond. Government, what little of it there was, had gone into hiding. The revolution had no capital, no currency, no army to speak of, no victories. All it had was belief. And that too was starting to falter. Washington knew the danger. If winter arrived and nothing changed, if the army continued to shrink, if Congress continued to hide, if the people lost hope, then the rebellion would die not with a bang, but a slow, silent collapse. And so, in the darkest days of that fall, a voice rang out. Not from a battlefield, but from a printing press. It was Thomas Paine. Again, the same man whose pamphlet Common Sense had shaken the colonies awake at the start of the year, now returned with another firebrand message. Written not from the comfort of a study, but from within the retreating army itself. He titled it, "The American Crisis," and its opening line was a thunderclap. These are the times that try men's souls. He didn't write for philosophers. He wrote for the soldiers shivering in the mud, for the farmers watching British troops march through their fields, for the patriots who had started to doubt. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, he warned. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. The words spread like fire. Officers read them aloud around campfires. Newspapers printed them on their front pages. Town criers shouted them in the streets. And for a moment, the fog of despair lifted. But words alone couldn't stop the bleeding. By November, Washington's army had shrunk to just a few thousand men, many of whose enlistments were set to expire at the end of December. If they left, Washington would have nothing. The revolution would be over. So he begged them to stay. He promised extra pay. He wrote to Congress for money, food, anything. But Congress was scattered, and the Treasury nearly empty. There were no reinforcements coming, no fresh supplies, no European armies marching to help. Not yet. Because while Washington was retreating, another American was on a different battlefield entirely, one made of diplomacy, charm, and chessboard maneuvering. Benjamin Franklin. The 70-year-old printer from Philadelphia, famous for his wit, wisdom, and spectacles, had crossed the Atlantic that fall to plead America's case in France. He wore a plain brown suit and a fur cap, playing the part of the humble Republican sage, a contrast to the powdered nobles of Versailles. But beneath that rustic image was a sharp mind. He knew what he was asking. France and Britain were ancient enemies, but France wasn't about to go to war just because Franklin asked nicely. He needed to prove that America had a chance, that the revolution wasn't a lost cause. So while Franklin smiled and dined and charmed the salons of Paris, he waited for some spark of victory to prove to the French court that the colonies were more than a dream. And back in Pennsylvania, Washington felt the same pressure. He needed a win, not just for strategy, for survival. But he didn't have the men, or the supplies, or the morale. All he had was time. A few weeks before his army would vanish, a narrow river between him and the enemy, and a desperate idea. In Trenton, New Jersey, the British had stationed a garrison of Hessian soldiers, German mercenaries known for their discipline and brutality. Washington learned they would be celebrating Christmas. He began planning something bold, something unexpected, something that would go down in history. But that was still to come. For now, in the final weeks of fall, 1776, America teetered on the edge. The cities were falling, the Congress was hiding, the soldiers were quitting, the people were surrendering to fear. And yet, somehow, the revolution didn't collapse. Because even in defeat, even in exhaustion, even in bitter cold and muddy boots, something endured. An idea that maybe freedom was worth fighting for. That maybe this experiment, impossible, fragile, dangerous, was not over. Not yet. Not if they could hold on through the winter. Not if they could try one more time. The river was frozen in places, choked with jagged ice floes that groaned and cracked in the darkness. The snow fell in sheets, blown sideways by a cutting wind. The night was silent except for the creak of oars, the rasp of boots, and the muffled orders of officers trying to guide boats across black, freezing water. Somewhere in the distance, a soldier slipped and fell. A musket clattered on the ice. No one spoke. It was Christmas night, 1776, and George Washington was about to risk everything. He had no choice. For months, the revolution had been unraveling. Defeat in New York, retreat through New Jersey, morale in shambles, Congress on the run, soldiers deserting daily, enlistments expiring in just days. If something didn't happen, something bold, something impossible, there would be no army left by January, and no revolution. So Washington made his move. His plan was simple on paper, but dangerous in execution. Cross the icy Delaware River at night, march 9 miles to Trenton, and attack a Hessian garrison at dawn. The Hessians were German mercenaries, professional soldiers hired by the British to crush the rebellion. At Trenton, they numbered roughly 1,400. Washington had about 2,400 troops, but most were ragged, cold, and poorly supplied. Some had no shoes, just blood-stained rags wrapped around their feet. The attack would be a surprise, and that was the only advantage, because nothing else favored the Americans. The river crossing alone was a nightmare. The Delaware was swollen with meltwater, icebergs grinding against each other like teeth. The wind howled, the temperature plummeted. Colonel Henry Knox, in charge of the artillery, had to move 18 cannons across in the dark. It took hours. Horses panicked, boats capsized. 2 men froze to death before they even reached the other side. The crossing was supposed to be completed by midnight. It wasn't finished until nearly 4 a.m. The attack, originally timed for pre-dawn, was now dangerously delayed. Dawn was coming. The element of surprise was slipping away. The men were soaked, freezing, hungry. Some collapsed in the snow. A few begged to turn back. But Washington pressed forward. He mounted his horse and led the march through the snow-covered roads of New Jersey. Lanterns flickered. Drums stayed silent. Bayonets gleamed faintly in the first light of morning. Officers urged the men forward, promising warmth, food, and revenge. The column split into 2 wings, approaching Trenton from different directions. At 8 a.m., they struck. The Hessians were caught completely off guard. They had celebrated Christmas the night before, but contrary to legend, they weren't drunk or asleep. They were simply unprepared. Their outposts had been manned, but they weren't expecting a full-scale assault in a blizzard. Washington's men surged through the streets, muskets flashing in the snow. The Hessians scrambled to form lines, but it was too late. American cannon fire blasted down the main road, scattering troops. Snipers picked off officers from windows. Hessians returned fire, but confusion spread. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rall, tried to rally them, but he was shot from his horse. Within 45 minutes, it was over. The Americans had killed or wounded over 100 enemy soldiers and captured nearly 900 more. Only a handful of their own men had been lost, and most of those to the cold, not the fighting. The victory was total and shocking. Washington stood in the town square of Trenton as prisoners were rounded up. His face, usually grave and stern, cracked into a faint smile. For the first time in months, there was hope. But it wasn't just the tactical victory that mattered. It was the timing. News of the attack spread like wildfire. By the time it reached Philadelphia, people poured into the streets. Bells rang, fireworks exploded. The Continental Congress, still shaken and scattered, felt a surge of renewed courage. And the army? Men who had planned to leave at the end of December re-enlisted. New recruits joined. The battered remnants of the Revolution stood up straighter. The tide had shifted, not on the battlefield alone, but in the mind. The world had watched the American army crumble. Now it watched it rise. The British were stunned. The Hessians humiliated. Loyalists panicked. But Washington wasn't finished. With momentum on his side, he struck again. On January 3rd, he attacked Princeton, another surprise move, and won. The British retreated. New Jersey erupted in rebellion against the occupation. In just 10 days, Washington had reversed the course of the war, from total collapse to stunning success, from despair to belief, from freezing silence to the roar of revolution, all because on one bitter night, in the darkest hour of the year, a weary army crossed a frozen river and refused to give up. The attack on Trenton didn't end the war, but it saved it. It proved that America could strike back, that Washington could outthink the greatest army on earth, that courage still burned, even in the snow, and that the revolution, beaten, bruised, battered, was still alive. The night had been long, but dawn had come. The year ended in silence. After Trenton and Princeton, after the ice and blood, after the panic in Philadelphia and the crossing of the Delaware, the guns quieted. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Snow settled over the fields of New Jersey, covering graves, cannon tracks, and the footprints of men who had marched through hell and back. By December 31st, 1776, the American Revolution was still alive, but just barely. No one could have predicted it. 6 months earlier, the colonies had declared independence with ringing bells and hopeful hearts. But by fall, everything seemed lost. The British had taken New York, pushed Washington into retreat, shattered morale, and occupied territory from Manhattan to the edge of Pennsylvania. The army had shrunk, Congress had fled, and the world had watched a rebellion unravel. And then, Trenton. A single strike, a daring move, a punch thrown by a desperate general on a freezing night. And with it, the tide shifted, if only slightly. But what had 1776 truly accomplished? Not victory. Not yet. The war was far from over. The British still held New York. They still had tens of thousands of troops in North America. Their navy ruled the sea. The American army was, at best, a fragile thread held together by hope and grit. And yet, something had changed, irrevocably. The Declaration of Independence was more than a statement of rebellion. It had transformed the conflict. What began as a fight over taxes, representation, and colonial rights had become something much larger, a revolution about human dignity. Before 1776, the colonies had asked for understanding. They had written petitions. They had pleaded for fairness. They had tried to remain within the British Empire. After 1776, they asked for nothing. They declared. They declared that kings are not gods, that rights are not gifts, and that people are not subjects by default. They declared that liberty is not just for the elite, that power must answer to the governed, that governments can and must be remade. That idea, the idea of America, had been written down, printed, and sent across the world. France read it. Spain read it. The courts of Europe took notice. They didn't rush to help, not yet. But they watched, and in coffee houses and universities, in dusty back rooms and candlelit studies, people whispered about it. A new country, a new people, a new kind of revolution. One not about replacing a ruler, but replacing the rules. In December 1776, no one knew how it would end. The British expected the rebellion to collapse with the winter. Washington expected the next spring to bring more battles, more losses, and more sacrifice. But the meaning of what had happened, that had begun to sink in. The colonists had crossed a point of no return. They could no longer imagine going back to the old order. Even if they lost, they would not forget what they had dared to dream. Farmers who had never left their villages now spoke of natural rights. Shopkeepers who once paid taxes in silence now quoted Jefferson's words by heart. Blacksmiths toasted to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. The idea had spread, and ideas are not easily killed. Even in defeat, the Americans had changed the conversation. They had refused to accept the logic of empire. They had challenged the assumption that those born into power were entitled to rule. And they had written it down, not as a vague hope, but as a demand. All men are created equal. Did they live up to it? Not yet. Slavery still existed. Women were still voiceless. Native peoples were still treated as obstacles. But the words were there. The promise was made. And even as the army limped through the final days of December, hungry and ragged, they carried with them not just muskets and bayonets, but something else. A vision, of a nation that didn't yet exist, but could, if they fought, if they endured, if they survived the next year. So what did 1776 mean? It meant that a people, once scattered across 13 colonies, had spoken with one voice. It meant that a general who had never commanded more than a few hundred men now led the cause of freedom for millions. It meant that an idea, raw, unpolished, inconsistent, but burning, had been unleashed. It meant that the world could no longer ignore what was happening in America. Not because of its military strength, not because of its wealth, but because of its courage, because of its willingness to say, "We are free," even when the odds said otherwise, even when the snow was deep and the sky was dark and the soldiers were starving. They still believed it. And that belief, the one declared in summer, tested in fall, and reborn in winter, was what 1776 meant. It was not the year the war ended. It was the year it began, truly began, with clarity, with fire, with purpose. It was the year America stopped being a collection of colonies and started becoming something more, a country, an idea, a revolution. Chapter 12. Echoes of 1776. The war did not end in 1776. In fact, it had only just begun. There were 7 more years of blood and suffering ahead. More battles, more defeats, more chances for the fragile dream to collapse under the weight of muskets and doubt. Valley Forge, Saratoga, Yorktown, names that would later define a triumph, but none of them yet written into history. But something had changed in 1776. The colonies had declared themselves not rebels, not subjects, but a nation. And while that word, nation, would be debated and doubted, feared and challenged, bent and stretched over centuries, it started here. With ink, with fire, with the bitter winter wind of a December night when George Washington crossed the Delaware River not just to win a battle, but to prove the cause still lived. The year was over, but its echo was just beginning. You can still hear it. It's there in the words carved into marble in Washington, D.C., and whispered in classrooms across the country. It's in the preamble, in every courtroom oath, in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. When, in the course of human events, we hold these truths to be self-evident. These phrases are more than words. They are promises. They are challenges. They are ideals that reach through time, often unmet, often contested, but never erased. The power of 1776 isn't that it gave us a perfect country. It didn't. It couldn't. Slavery still stained the land. Women had no voice. Native nations were pushed aside, their sovereignty denied. The founders were visionaries, yes, but also men of their time and prisoners of their own contradictions. And yet, they dared to write a document that claimed all men were created equal, even when they themselves didn't live by it. They planted a seed that would one day grow into abolition, suffrage, civil rights. They gave future generations the words to hold their nation accountable, to say, "You promised." And so the Declaration of Independence became more than a statement of separation. It became a mirror, one that every generation has had to look into and ask, are we living up to this? Sometimes the answer has been yes. More often, it's been not yet. But still we ask, still we try. And that, more than any battlefield victory, is the real legacy of 1776. It created a country rooted in argument. A nation not defined by bloodlines or thrones, but by ideas, by principles that must be constantly debated, defended, and reimagined. The revolution made that possible, and it made something else possible too. Belief Belief that ordinary people could govern themselves, that liberty was worth bleeding for, that even in the darkest winters of defeat, a ragged army and a determined people could keep moving forward. We still return to those images. Washington, standing in the boat, wrapped in a cloak, crossing the Delaware with the storm swirling around him. That's not just art. It's myth. It's memory. It's something deeper. A symbol of resilience. The idea that sometimes you cross the river not because it's safe, but because you have to. Because turning back is surrender. Because someone has to go first. That's what Washington did. That's what the soldiers at Trenton did. That's what the signers of the Declaration did when they put their names to paper, knowing full well it could mean the gallows. They went first. And every generation since has followed in their wake, across different rivers, facing different storms. Civil War, World War, economic collapse, civil rights battles, terrorism, political strife. The road has never been straight, never smooth, but it's always led forward because of the year that lit the path. 1776. That year gave America its story. And every country needs a story. It's not about pretending the founding was perfect. It wasn't. But it was bold. It was a gamble on the idea that liberty and equality could form the foundation of something new. A gamble on the idea that power belongs to the people. A gamble on the belief that you can throw off an empire and build something better. It's easy now, centuries later, to take that for granted. To forget that in 1776, success was far from certain. No one knew if the colonies could hold together, if France would join the fight, if the Continental Army would even exist by spring. And yet, they moved forward anyway. They declared independence before they had won a single major battle. They chose liberty not because it was easy, but because it was right. That's what echoes. Not just the muskets and drums, but the courage, the risk, the vision. Every generation hears it differently. In 1863, Lincoln heard it and called the nation to a new birth of freedom. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. heard it and said, "I have a dream." Holding the Declaration up like a mirror. In every protest, every courtroom, every quiet conversation about who we are and who we want to be, that echo is there. It's in the words, the ideas, the belief that a nation can be more than a flag or a government. It can be a promise. But promises must be kept. And that's where we come in. Because the story of 1776 didn't end in 1776. It didn't end in 1781 or 1789 or 1865 or 1964. It hasn't ended at all. It's a story we are still writing. Every citizen, every vote, every act of conscience. We carry that year with us, not just in fireworks and parades, but in the choices we make. To speak up, to dissent, to dream, to fight for a more perfect union, even knowing it will never truly be perfect. Because that's what 1776 teaches us. That freedom isn't a gift. It's a responsibility. That democracy isn't a destination. It's a constant struggle. That America isn't finished. It's still becoming, still reaching, still echoing. And so, as we close the book on this year, on this journey through the fire and frost of revolution, we remember not just what happened, but why it happened. Because a group of flawed, frightened, ordinary people believed in something extraordinary and dared to declare it to the world. That we are all created equal, that we are born with rights that no king can take, that governments exist for the governed, and that when they fail, it is our right, our duty, to change them. These are not just the echoes of a distant war. They are the heartbeat of a living idea. The idea that we, the people, not just in 1776, but today, are the ones who must carry the flame forward, not because the world is easy, but because freedom is worth it. That was the gift of 1776. And it still speaks, even now, especially now.